Namo Ramana. Before we commence the Vivekachoodamani meditation, may I request Ujjulji to chant Muktagatrayam for us. Namo Ramana.
Namo Ramana. Ekamaksharam Hridi Nirantaram Bhasate Swayam Likyate Katam Hridaya Kuhara Madhye Kevalam Brahmamatram Hyahamahami Sakshat Atmarupena Bhati Hridi Vishamanasa Swam Chinvata Majjatava Pavanachalanarodhat Atmanishto Bhavatvam Deham Rinmayavajjadatmakamaham Buddhirna tasyasyato Naham tattatapeta sukti samaye Siddhatma sadbhavatah Koham bhavayutak kuto varadhiya Drishtatmanishtatmanam Soham spurtitaya Arunachala Shivaha Purno Vibhati Swayam Soham spurtitaya Arunachala Shivaha Purno Vibhati Swayam. Namo Ramana.
Namo Ramana. Thank you for that wonderful chanting. We have been meditating on Vivekachoodamani, the original Sanskrit is by Acharya Adi Shankara Bhagavad-Pada, and the Tamil translation in prose form is by Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi, and we have been primarily depending on the prose version, but keeping close tab on the Shankar Math publication and basically the Shankar Math publication of the Vivekachoodamani with the English translation and Sanskrit original. We see that Bhagavan has touched upon the whole text without leaving anything and given his special touch in some places. We are in having completed up to verse number 138, that is the description of the Acharya on the self. Let us gather ourselves a little bit, as there has been a gap in our the classes that we have been having. We can regroup ourselves like this, that primarily the heart of the work starts from verse number 51, where the Shishya questions or requests the Acharya To clear his doubts regarding, it begins, the 51st verse begin, Ko nama bandha katameva agatah. So like that, the 6 questions, the 7 questions asked there are, what is bondage? How has it arisen? How is it sustained? How is release from it? So 4 questions, all connected with bondage. What is bondage? How has it arisen? How is it sustained? How is the release from it? All the 4 are going to be addressed in this group of verses we are going to see today. And we see that the Acharya has covered the other questions. That is the 5th question, what is the not self? We went through the verses about the gross body, the subtle body, and the causal body. The Acharya describing what is the not self. What is the highest self? That is the 6th question. And we have covered that in our last session. What is the highest self, the nature of the self? And what is the differentiation, the Viveka between self and non-self is the 7th question, which the Acharya is going to take in the subsequent verses. But primarily, apart from the 7th question, all the questions are addressed by the time we finish this session, where we are going to be taken through what is bondage by the Acharya, verses 139 through verse 135, 155, both inclusive. 139 to 155, both the verses included. The whole chapter is on what is bondage, how it has arisen, how it is sustained, and how to get release from it. All these 4 questions, the first 4 questions in verse number 51, what is bondage, how it has arisen, how it is sustained, how is the release from it. All the 4 are answered in this segment on what is bondage. Prior to this, he has already answered what is the not self, what is the highest self, and he is going to take up the 7th question, how to have the Vivekachoodamani between the self and the non-self. In detail, he is going to take us through the koshas after verse 155. But today, our the class or session satsang is on verses 139 through 155, which covers the area of what is bondage. And interestingly, the teachings of the Acharya, though it uses the word ignorance, the teachings use the word ignorance, primarily the Bhagavan's definition of the root problem of all miseries. Bhagavan defines it as the Chit Jada Granthi. The gross body does not say I. The Satchit does not have rise or fall. In between these two, identifying with the non-self body, there arises to the extent of the body the ego. This is called the Chit Jada Granthi. This itself is Bandham, Jivan, Nutpamai, Agandai, Samsaram, mind. This is Bhagavan's pointer to what is the root cause of bondage, root cause of all miseries. The same teachings we are going to find in a slightly expanded form from the Acharya. The Acharya begins in verse number 139 by saying that bondage is the conception of I in the not self. It has happened to this person because of ignorance crossed, that is the cause of the advent of birth and death. It is only because of this rise of the I towards the non-self, perceiving the unreal body as real and thinking of it to be the self, that he nourishes, waters, safeguards the body through the sense objects. Like silkworm weaves its silk thread to protect itself, but ultimately gets killed for that silk thread itself. That's how Bhagavan takes us to the explanation of the first verse. The explanation in the mat, you don't find that the silkworm is killed for its thread, but Bhagavan adds that small bit that by the poshana through the sense objects itself, by the weaving of the further and further threads, the body reaches a point where it cannot be sustained anymore. Old age, illness, they consume it, and death superimposes itself and disintegrates the body. So the very process of adding is an unsustainable activity. Adding of the threads, like the silkworm, the identification of the self with the non-self. We have seen that in Bhagavan's teachings, that the moment you identify with a non-self, you will see only the non-self as Tat. In the Tattvamasi, the Tat is the supreme being or the supreme Brahman. But the moment you identify yourself with a non-self, you will see the supreme being as the non-self or the world of names and forms. The very same supreme being you will see as the names and forms. Why? Because you have identified with the non-self called the body. The body, of course, has panchakoshas, which we will be seeing later. But then, what is Bhagavan's verse here? Bhagavan says, Urupatri undam, Urupatri nirkum, Urupatri undu migavongum, Uruvittu urupatrum, Edinal otam pidikkum, Uruvatra peya hande or, and Uruvam tanayin ulagu paramatram, Uruvam tanandrel uvatrin uruvate, Kannurudal yavanevar, Kandalar kaatshi undo, Kannaduthan, Andamila kat. Two verses from Ulladu Narpadu which go like this, that the ego, the Chitjada Granthi, has this habit of rising, only holding on to a form. It sustains itself. How is the bondage sustained? It sustains itself by keeping on holding on the form. It grows further by eating and consuming more and more silk threads of name and form. Uruvittu urupatrum. When death superimposes one form, Bhagavan says from his experience of placing his hands at the time of the moving on of or the moving in of the spirit, in the case of Amma and Palaniswami, Bhagavan says that the jiva, it flits between the next body it has to take and the current form in a dream-like experience. In a dream-like experience, it shifts between the new body and this body, and holding on to the new body only, it leaves this body. So, for poetic purposes, the verse goes there as Uruvittu urupatrum. It will leave one form and hold the other. But in chronology, it is that it will first cling to the other form and then only let go of the previous form. But this is the nature of the ego. And how the bondage arises, the moment you identify with the gross body, you see the Tat in the Tattvamasi, you see the Tat as the gross world of names and forms. The moment you identify with a subtle body, yourself, you will see the Tat, the Supreme Being, as a whole lot of thoughts. The moment you go to sleep as the germ form in the Karana Sharira, you will be experiencing the Tat also as the infinite bliss, but not having removed the ignorance, you will be pushed out of the temporary state of deep sleep back into waking. So this is the process of bondage. And that is what the Acharya says in verse number 140 also. The next verse. The conception of that, the tat, in that which is not. This is something which we find in the Shankar Mat translation, that the Supreme Being, the Tat in the Tattvamasi, will become full of gross names and forms the moment you identify with the gross body. The Tat or the Supreme Being will become all the subtle thoughts the moment you identify with the subtle body. So that is what is there in the first two verses of definition of bondage. In these two verses, how bondage comes into being out of ignorance, that the self identifies itself with the non-self, superimposing the nature of the self on somewhere it is not, and superimposing the limitations of the non-self on the self. This is called as abhyasa. This is called as the avarana or veiling. This is arising out of the nature of tamas. And Bhagavan uses the two words of tamas and rajas to explain the further 8 verses on bondage. That the tamas is used to cover the veiling of the self, the avarana, and the rajas is the term Bhagavan uses to explain the projection, the ignorance manifesting as this multiplicity of names and forms. But the first two verses in the bondage section, that is 139 and 140, identify the root cause, which Bhagavan says is the root cause. From here on, the Acharya is going on to some explanation of the manifestation of bondage, which Bhagavan covers in just one word. Ahandai undayin anaitum undakum. Agandai inrel indranaitum. In verse number 26 of Ulladu Narpadu, Bhagavan says, the moment the ego rises and identifies with the non-self, all the miseries arise. And the moment it goes down into sleep and laya, all the miseries vanish. Therefore, to search as to what is this ego is to get rid of all the miseries in one stroke. All the miseries of bondage in one stroke is just to inquire into what is this ego, who am I, or whence am I, is the teaching of Bhagavan. The Acharya goes into a little bit of the explanation of the manifestation of this ignorance in the form of many troubles. In the form of 8 verses, he covers the manifestation of ignorance. So, those 8 verses are 141 through 148. We find that the analogy used for the screening and the projection are of, first of all, the analogy of the clouds being created by the sun's rays. The clouds themselves are created by the sun's rays. The heat, they are the primary source of the water evaporation and forming of the clouds. But that means the Maya Shakti is not apart from the Atma Shakti. The Maya Shakti, the Atma Shakti, which is the Adhara, which is the self-luminous self, the Maya Shakti cannot claim independent existence. Therefore, here the Acharya says, just like the sun's rays themselves create the clouds, and those very clouds cover up the sun, the non-self, which are all generated by the ignorance or the veiling, the vikshepas, the vikshepas rise and cover the presence of the Atmasvarupa. That means the primary ignorance of attaching ourselves with the body, we feel what is so great that I am just saying I am this body, but then by limiting our existence to this body, immediately springs the Supreme Brahman as all the gross names and forms or the Ishvara's Virat Swarupa. And In Mandukya Upanishad, we are told that the Ishvara occupies the whole gross existence as the Virat, and the Ishvara's occupation itself becomes Maya for the Jiva. The Ishvara's identification with the gross body, if that were to be taken to be his reality, then that identification with the gross world, that itself acts as the Maya in which the Jiva is trapped. And of course, the Sukshma Sharira of Ishvara, the Hiranyagarbha, that is where the Jiva is trapped in the dream state. And the Ishwaratva, the Prajnana Dhana of deep sleep, that is where we all go into deep sleep as Prajnas, says Mandukya Upanishad, describing the three states in terms of Ishvara and the Jiva. The Vaishwanara and the Vishwa, the Hiranyagarbha and the Tejasa, the Ishvara and the Prajna, these are the bondages that the Ishvara and Jiva undergo by adhyasa, by not knowing the self. Sat swabhavato vastu kevalam. Bhagavan says, Isha jivayor vesha dhipita. Sat swabhavato vastu kevalam. As the self, both have the same truth. Veshahanatah swatma darshanam, Isha darshanam swatma rupatah. That is going to be suggested in the last few verses we are going to see, 150 onwards. What is Veshahanatah? But let us see the second analogy. The first analogy is that the very clouds created by the heat of the sun, they cover the sun. The second analogy is the problems we face in the world of various types of miseries. It is not one type of misery. We see a close friend who appeared so healthy, the healthiest of the four friends that we were together. Suddenly some calcium deficiency, 2 days in coma. Means the healthiest person of the group that we know, just one of the elements showing deficiency, and you see that whole family in misery, going into ICU, coming out. And that is the misery of this verse that is taken up as the misery of the stormy winds and the gale and other things that are present in a cloudy and foggy day where the sun has been covered up. It's all cold and blistery, and the traveler, Acharya says, is caught up in the winds that are gustily blowing here and there, in that cold and chill. That is what we experience in samsara. That everything seems to be going bright and shiny. Suddenly the sun gets clouded. There is blustery winds. We are shivering, suffering, not from one, and all these are potentially present all the time. The miseries of samsara are present all the time. The Damocles sword, says the Acharya. That is the second analogy given of blustery winds and present in the when the sun is clouded up. Now, having completed the discovery of samsara, the Acharya comes to a verse number 147, which is actually a beautiful description of the samsara as a tree. This whole samsara, which we see both at the jiva perspective as well as the whole cosmic perspective, the Acharya builds a picture before us that the ignorance of identifying the self with the non-self is the seed of samsara. The ignorance is the seed. The identifying or raising as the I, that is, I am this body, I am this subtle body or gross body or karana sharira, that he says is the shoot, is the first raising of the shoot. The tree of samsara, the seed is ignorance. The conception of the body is the self is the sprout. desire or attachment is the tender leaf. Is the first tender leaf. Still the tree is going to come up. The seed has now grown. The I am the body idea is at the immediate next stage to ignorance of the self. Then comes desire or attachment. The moment you have I am this body, you have desire. Desire is the word Bhagavan uses. Attachment is the description that the Shankar Mutt translation uses. Either way, both come because we have limited ourselves to the non-self. This tree, just imagine, there's the tree of samsara. The bija, the seed is ignorance, not knowing. That is bondage. And the I am the body idea is the first sprouting. Then what happens? The desire or attachment, because the I am the body limitation is there, that is the first leaf and the tree starts growing. The actions done is the water. You are watering the roots of the plant and the body starts growing. The body, the karma sharira, either from the individual's perspective or whole from the cosmic perspective, the samsara tree starts growing. That through the ignorance as the seed, through the sprouting of I am the body thought, and then the desires and attachments which come, they come as the leaf. Then the body that is formed out of having more and more desires, that is the trunk of samsara. The body of the Ishvara, the gross body, is keeping on adding, expanding as the trunk of the tree. The life currents are the small branches. Bhagavan translates it as our janmas. The various rebirths we take are the small branches in the tree. Then in each rebirth, our senses with which we access the non-self keep on eating, keep on adding more and more experiences. That is where the tree grows, he says. That the group of senses form the tips of those branches from which the outer world is sensed and the tree starts growing. The sense objects that the tips perceive, let us keep them as the flowers, says the Acharya. They are the flowers in the tree. The misery of various sorts resulting from various deeds, they are the fruit. And this jiva, which is also part and parcel of the tree, you have to imagine it like that, is the bird that comes and partakes of the taste of these miseries in the fruit. It's almost like the two-bird analogy we have in the Vedanta, that there is the self which is unfettered, which is reveling in itself. There is the smaller bird which goes and tastes the fruits of the tree. And in that analogy, sometimes it is experiencing good experiences, sometimes whenever it is experiencing a bitter fruit, it looks up to the self. That is the analogy given there. But here, the Acharya is unrelenting. He says all the fruits of this tree are miseries. Even what we call, there is no really the sweet fruit at all. It is all misery. Let's go through the analogy. This is verse number 147 of Vivekachoodamani, where you get the analogy to the samsara. The quickly going through that is the seed is the ignorance. The I am the body idea is the first step that the tree takes. And the moment the I am the body idea comes, the third is desire and attachment start, and the tree starts, the body of the tree starts growing, and the various janmas that each jiva takes, adding on to the body of the tree, they are the branches, the small branches. The senses with which each janma is taken is the tips of those branches, and the flowers that come in those tips, they are the sense objects that the senses are experiencing, and the fruits are the miseries of the various actions that the small bird comes and the small bird calls Jiva, it comes and eats, is the analogy given. This is in verse number 147. So the bondage has sprouted into a whole big tree. The bondage arising out of ignorance. Bhagavan says in simple terms, Agandai undayin, Anaithum undam. So these various descriptions we won't trouble ourselves with, but all these are included and crossed by Bhagavan. That the branches, the various janmas. Whenever somebody asks Bhagavan that what will happen in my next janma, if you refer to Acharya's teachings, he will say, yes, you will be in that branch, you will get more fruits, but all out of ignorance, the root. Bhagavan will only say that, see, if you are born now, Agandai undayin, Anaithum undam. If you arise now, then you will have to think of what you are going to be in future, what we were in past. See, if you are born now, he will say, Agandai undayin, Marujanmam undagam. Agandai indre, Marujanmam indre. Agandai undayin, the fruits of the miseries will arise. Agandai indre in running. But the learning of Acharya's teaching here helps us to understand the depth of Bhagavan's teachings, how in one stroke, in the direct path of self-attention, he relieves us of all the miseries possible. That when we don't go the way of the Anatma and stay with the Atma, there is no past, present, future. All the three branches of time are Anatma in which the Jiva is trapped. We regret about the past, we want to anxiously create a future where we are better off. This movement of the Jiva is arrested when the root of ignorance is addressed by asking for whom is this past, present, future. So we understand how the whole tree of samsara Bhagavan addresses as Agandai undayin, Anaithum undahum. This bondage of not self has its root in ignorance and is said to be innate, beginningless, and the Shankarmut translation says endless. Bhagavan says, and the Sanskrit word is Anantam. But Bhagavan says, the Acharya assures, because he does assure in the subsequent verses, that I will show you a way out of samsara. That the 148th verse says that this is the ignorance that is beginningless. The Maya or the Ajnana is said to be Anadi. In that particular verse, it is said it appears to be Ananta also. But Bhagavan, taking the meaning from the whole cluster of verses, which the Acharya does in the next two verses itself, he addresses how this ignorance is overcome, how bondage is overcome. I will show you a way out because Maya can be ended. And that is the 148th verse, that this bondage seems to be Anadi, but it can be ended. If not ended, then what are the miseries? It will flood of miseries like birth, death, disease, old age, etc. All these are going to be found if this bondage is not ended. Now the next question is taken up from 51. How is release obtained? How is bondage created, maintained, and sustained? All these things are covered in these verses. Now the fourth question as to how do we get release from bondage is addressed in the next 2 or 3 verses. The Acharya says this bondage, which is ignorance, cannot be cut by missiles or weapons or by wind or by fire or by a million good actions that we have seen in Atma Bodha, that since the actions or karma do not have any ability to address ignorance, and in fact they all arise with ignorance as the basis. Any number of karmas you do, it is not going to remove the ajnana, is the Acharya's teaching here. Don't worry, he is going to give a relief in the next verse itself. In 149th verse, how to get release from bondage? That first of all we should understand that we cannot get release from bondage by some astras, by shastras, by various actions, but only by the sword of discrimination, the realization of the discrimination between the self and the non-self. This is the only instrument that you have to discriminate, that I have identified with the body. I am not the body, but I have identified with the body. We have seen that Bhagavan helps one find that when the discussion between a group of people who come to Bhagavan and ask, why are you having the Rupa Sadhana in the ashram? Does God have a form? Ask the group of people. Bhagavan says, who says God has form? And the person says that, oh, then you are saying God does not have form, but why are you allowing worship here in the ashram? Then Bhagavan says, let God be. Tell me, do you have form? And the person says, yes, I am this form standing in front of you. Were you this form in deep sleep? And the person continues to say, yes, before I went to sleep, I was the body. After I got up from sleep, I am still the body. Therefore, I must have been the body in deep sleep also. Then Bhagavan says, when the body dies, does it say that I should not be taken out of this house? This house is registered in my name. And then the person realizes, no, I am not this body. I am the spirit within this body. Such a simple thing. And Bhagavan says, see, this is the error you are making. All this time, you were saying, I am this body, and your pravritti has been out of that. Your interaction, your vyavahara has been, I am this body. Whereas, a little bit of enquiry will show that you are not the body, but you are the spirit within the body. And that is what Bhagavan says to Natanananda Swami. When Natanananda Swami comes first and says, Bhagavan, I want your grace to find the same state of jnana that you are in, I want your grace. And Bhagavan asks him, is the body that is standing in front of me asking this question, or the awareness within the body asking me the question? And Natanananda Swami is wise enough to say, the awareness within the body is asking you the question to give me grace. And Bhagavan says, if that awareness tries to seek the source from where it arises, there it will know what is grace, what is God, and what is its true nature. This is the Upadesha given by Bhagavan, that now the self, the awareness is identified with the non-self and does all the actions like that. That I am so and so. I am this body, I am this mental identity. Whereas a little bit of enquiry, little bit of vichara shows that we are not that. And we are the spirit. And Bhagavan says, trace the spirit to its source. And there the real self will be available. That is the freedom from bondage that Bhagavan says. Let us see how Acharya takes it. That first of all, the Acharya says the sword that we have to use is the discrimination between self and non-self. Though he has condemned action in the previous verse, that any number of actions cannot give you this release from bondage, in verse number 150, the next one, he comes to our aid and says that the actions that you do, having complete faith in the Vedas, the actions of the dharma that are mentioned in the Vedas, keep doing it, keep abiding with faith in the Vedas, that will purify your mind, and with that purified mind, your meditations will become better and better, your discrimination will become better and better, and you will find the self. Is the teaching of Bhagavan, is the teaching of Acharya in verse number 150. Though in verse number 149, he says, no number of actions can give you, only the discrimination is this word, but to develop that discrimination, you need purity of mind, he says. The purity of mind is required. I have myself shared that I have received Bhagavan's teachings in 1998 or 97 from Ramana Maharshi Center for Learning, giving the book on Bhagavan's teachings to my daughter in her school. But I could not make sense of what is the who am I teachings there, because my purpose then was to make her understand and get a recognition in the school. And I did not make much headway in understanding what who am I was then. But much more purification was required, and I had to go through a mantra japa for 2-3 years and a practice of observing my own thoughts for another year before who am I came back again, and this time I could understand what it meant. That means we have to carry out the dharma, we have to carry out our practices, the actions, which will by themselves not be the direct cause for the release from bondage, but they have this sub purpose of purifying us, the purifying the self, so that the discrimination becomes clear. That is what the Acharya says. Now, how do we reconcile that with the direct teaching of self-attention of Bhagavan? We had a nice reconciliation in our workshop, in our self-enquiry workshop, where we discovered that all the ethics, the dharma, the observation of the Vedantic suggestions for right action, they are all turning towards the self. That speaking the truth, acting dharmically, doing pitru karma, all these are the turning inward as to what am I doing away from what I am achieving. So we discovered that all those are based on one principle. Bhagavan used to say all sadhana in whichever area it is based on tyaga. We discovered that day that all sadhana is turning inward, is turning towards the self. Now, what do we do with this discrimination? The discrimination between self and the non-self, we find that we are covered up, the self is covered up by the 5 sheets. The 5 sheets of Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya and Anandamaya. These are like the moss covering the water in a well, says the Acharya. The moss covering in the water in a, they are the Panchakoshas that we have. And the next verse is that if you remove the moss, you will get the water which will quench your thirst as well as bring coolness in the summer. Whatever that water does, whatever the water of self, which gives complete bliss, complete consciousness, complete existence, the Satchita Ananda, you can drink of it the moment you clear yourself of the Panchakoshas. You clear yourself of the moss that is covering the pure water. The discrimination between self and the non-self must be made by a knowing person for getting released from bondage. It is only that by doing this discrimination and doing the neti of removing all the koshas, that we get to the blissful, ever conscious, the self-luminous, the supreme being of the self. Separating the innermost, unattached, actionless self from the category of experienced objects, Bhagavan says, having come to the self of all, we should merge in the self in such a way that whatever we were calling as non-self earlier, they all get merged in the self alone is situation. That whenever you find that some non-self is coming in perception for you, even time and space, even the God's will versus the free will, all these you have to merge in the self by asking for whom. For whom is this? For whom is this? What happens? What is the tat which was seen as the gross world? The tat which was seen as multiple thoughts, all merge in the self-luminous self. It is not only that your panchakoshas, they merge in the supreme self. It is that the whole gross world, the whole subtle world, the whole the causal world of deep sleep, all the three merge into the self of all, into the self-luminous self, along with the I. This is what is said in verse 4 of Ulladunartham. உருவம் தானன்றேல் உவற்றின் உருவத்தை கண்ணுறுதல் யாவன் எவன் கண்ணலார் காட்சி உண்டோ கண் அது தான் அந்தமிலா கண். The self is the limitless, the self alone seeing, self-luminous self. It doesn't have a trace of non-self. When you are not attached to any of the koshas, the Tat, the Parabrahman, reveals its real nature as the self of all. This is what is mentioned by the Acharya as the merging of all the non-self into the self, like the merging of the leaves in the pith of the grass. The Garbha grass, what they do, they usually take the center portion out. Here the Acharya is saying, merge all the leaves into the center portion. And Bhagavan explains that by saying in Ulladunarpadu that the moment you dip the Panchakoshas, the moment you dip the Panchakoshas into the Atma Swarupa, the entire creation, the gross, subtle and causal, it merges in the Atma Swarupa, it merges in the self-luminous self. In a Bhakti Marga way, this is expressed in Aksharamanamale by Bhagavan. ஐம்புலக் கள்வர் அகத்தினில் புகும்போது அகத்தில் நீ இலையோ அருணாச்சலா ஒருவனாம் உன்னை ஒளித்தவர் வருவார் உன் சூதே இது அருணாச்சலம். ஐம்புலக் கள்வர், the non-self of the five senses, they are the ones who rob me of self-attention because they pull me away from you. They drag me as the jiva away from you. But when they entered into the home called Aham, were you not there? Did you go missing? Did the self of all go missing? You are ever present. There is not a moment when the Satchit is not there. Oruvana munnai olithavar varuvar unsude. This whole creation, gross, subtle and causal, is only your soothe, your maya. And when I hold you as the Satchit, the whole creation, the maya, gets absorbed in you, the Satchit. Not only do my indriyas, panchendriyas, the panchakoshas are absorbed in you, Arunachala, the Satchit, but the whole creation, unsudu, unnudiya maya, unnudiya udambu, unnudiya manam, all these get absorbed in the I, in the Satchit of Arunachala. Irundu Olir. The surrender of Bhakti Marga and Vichara of Jnana Marga both bring us to the self of all, where not only our Panchakoshas are absorbed in the self-luminous self, the whole gross world, subtle world, and causal world all get observed and shine only as the I. Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Ramana. Namo Ramana. Shall we sit in Atmacharam for 10 minutes? Ujjalji? Namo Ramana.
Namo Ramana. Prostrations to Ramana, shining as the self in all beings. By the immense grace of the self manifest as Ramana, we have been meditating with Nandakumar ji on the Vivekachoodamani of Adi Shankara Bhagavad Pada as translated by Bhagavan into Tamil prose. And we have been getting deeper and deeper insights and repeated hammering, I would say, repeated hammering on the nature of ignorance, on the calamity that can strike us if we get engrossed in this illusion of ignorance. And today's session was more directly addressed towards the nature of bondage. And Nandakumarji said it ends with hope that we could cut across this huge or fell this huge tree of bondage which has been described by Bhagavad Pada. And Bhagavan says that before the tree can sprout, Bhagavan says before it sprouts itself, even as it is sprouting, even as the I thought is taking a form of a thought. And once it takes the form of a thought, in that thought, it has already moved from the primary identification of I am the body to the various experiences which are described as the fruits of the tree. So before that happens, Bhagavan says, as it is sprouting, you catch hold of it. You question it there and then as a thought sprouts. And what happens if we do not do that? We get into a whole tree. Nandakumarji would often say that it is possible that one thought, getting engaged in one thought, can lead us to millions of experiences. And that is also our own anubhava, that we have seen it in our lives, that if we allow a thought to move outwards, instead of turning it back to its source, it will actually proliferate. Millions of thoughts will be there related to that thought. That's why Bhagavan says, as it is said here in the Vivekachoodamani, that every fruit is misery. Bhagavan says, every thought is misery. Why is every thought misery? Because it clouds the sunlight of the self. It is, yes, it is springing from the self. Because what is thought? What is thought? Thought is not apart from the self. Just as the example has been given, the cloud is actually created by sunlight, but it hides the sunlight. Even so, thought is nothing but consciousness. How can thought be anything other than consciousness? However, the thought having associated itself with ignorance through identification with the form, I am so and so, becomes of the nature of jada. It becomes what Bhagavan calls insentient. He says, Vigraha Indriya Pranadhi Tamaha Tat Jadam Hi Asat. All these are jada. All these are asat. They are not the truth. So if thought is not cut at its source, even as it rises, what happens is it continues the stream of identification and leads to misery. Bhagavan tells us this at the very onset of Upadesha Saram. Kriti Mahodadhau Patana Karanam Phalama Shashvatam Gati Nirodhakam. Action does not lead to self-awareness because it is jada. Karma kim param, karma tad jadam. It is only jada. What does action do? It only makes us fall into the ocean of further and further actions. Kriti mahodadhau patana karanam. Gati nirodhakam. It cannot lead to liberation, Bhagavan tells us. What Bhagavad Pada is saying here in Vivekachoodamani, that we will not get liberation through action. Bhagavan has told us at the very outset of Upadesha Saram, action cannot lead to liberation. And it is important for us to understand this because the mind tends to think or associate the fruits of action with the action itself. If I sing a song and my mind feels happy while singing the song, it even feels peaceful, and for a moment maybe there is some silence as well experienced, then my mind tells me, oh, because of singing this song, I experienced this silence. These are the so-called good actions which we may do, singing about Bhagavan. So, what happens? Instead of recognizing that joy can only spring from the self alone is the source of bliss, the action leads us into thinking that it is giving the fruit of bliss. Therefore, one falls into the trap of further action. This is why the warning that no action whatsoever can give us liberation. So, Bhagavan does not recommend any actions. At the same time, he does not ask us to keep away from actions either, because if one chooses not to act, such a choice in itself would become an action. If I say I am going to sit in one place the whole day long, such a choice in itself would be an action. So every choice is an action. So Bhagavan does not ask us to get into this rigmarole or this trap or conundrum of choosing actions or not choosing actions. On the other hand, he asks us to turn attention back to the source every time the primary action of thought itself happens. And further, Bhagavan also guides us to do Ishwararpitam karma as a purificatory step. Ishwararpitam nichayakritam chitta shodhakam mukti sadhakam. Their action, which is Ishwararpita, which is done without any desire for results, purifies the mind, which in turn helps the mind to gain the power of discrimination, to gain the power of inquiry, to be able to hold on to the inquiry. So, the action about which Bhagavan says we do not have any choice. In fact, he tells Mother, you don't have any choice about situations and actions. When we stay with that teaching of Bhagavan, what happens? We do not worry about acting or not acting, because we will be allowed, will be made to act when we have to act, and will be made to sit silent whenever we have to sit quiet. So if we do not have, or we are not destined to move anywhere out of the house on that day, we will be sitting inside the house and we may not achieve whatever we have planned to achieve at that time. But it does not matter, says Bhagavan, because that is according to the plan, supreme plan. But what is given to us at all times is the capacity to discriminate. Discriminate how? By asking ourselves, for whom is this thought? And when the answer comes, it is for me, asking oneself, who am I? So this power Bhagavan gives us, this freedom Bhagavan gives us at all times. And everything else is given by the Supreme, by the Bhagavad Pada and by Bhagavan as a warning to us, because it is so easy to fall into the trap of action. It could be even at a very, very subtle level. So one has to remain alert and hold on to the self-enquiry which is available from moment to moment by the supreme grace. Om Namo Bhagavate.
Namo Ramana.
Namo
Ramana.
Ramana.
Namo Ramana.